Coming up on the Danny Moses Show, how the book and the movie The Big Short has impacted me both personally and professionally. And speaking of books, I sit down with best-selling author Bethany McLean, who has chronicled some of the biggest financial stories of the last several decades. We find out what she's focused on today. And of course, my Kalshi Picks of the Week.
Over 30 years of beating Wall Street, predicting the famous Big Short. Now, he's here for you. This is the Danny Moses Show.
Having been a character in both the book and the movie The Big Short certainly has had its benefits, but it also has its drawbacks. Inevitably, almost every time I'm interviewed, or if I'm a guest on a podcast or show, I'm introduced as Danny Moses from The Big Short. Then there are a few standard questions that normally follow. First, is there another Big Short out there? If so, what is it and when will it happen? Secondly, do you see any similarities today to what you saw then? Next, when did you first realize that we were going to have a housing and mortgage crisis? And lastly, were you happy with how you were portrayed in the movie, and was it accurate? Let me address each of these questions. Financial history is littered with boom and bust cycles, each with different causes and impacts on the economy. Without fail, innovative and transformative business ideas are often exploited and levered and reach a breaking point where the economic viability and early success is quickly compromised as everybody tries to get in on the action. Whether it was railroads in the late 19th century or the panic of 1907 when the viability of the U.S. banking system was brought into question and J.P. Morgan himself helped rescue the system, which actually led to the creation of the Federal Reserve, it's always something. We all know about the crash of 1929, which led to the Great Depression, the oil shock in the 70s, the crash in 87, the dot-com bubble, and of course, the Great Financial Crisis. While all of these events had unique catalysts, history has proven that because of human behavior, that thing might not repeat but will often rhyme. So, is there another Big Short out there? There is something always brewing, and it's just a matter of time before the trade that everybody is in, like everything surrounding AI, gets too crowded and you start to hear things like, this time is different, and valuation doesn't matter. Tie this in with the growth in private credit, which in some cases is helping fuel that AI trade, and you can envision a form of contagion that could feed on itself if things begin to unwind. Do I see similarities today that I saw during the GFC? Some, such as growth in private credit that was ironically fueled by financial reforms post-GFC when banks had their hands tied and had to rein in lending. A new industry was born. As I just talked about its role in AI, private credit extends well beyond that. And because these loans don't sit in the traditional banking system, there is a belief that if things turn sour, it won't wreak havoc on the markets and the economy. Unfortunately, I don't believe this is the case. Just because the banks don't have deposits at risk this time around doesn't mean that the knock-on effects won't be felt throughout the system. We are beginning to see some cracks, and while things still feel contained, it won't take much for the fault lines to start fracturing. So when did we know that the housing crisis had reached the point of no return? Well, it was a combination of things. We saw how much money Wall Street was making packaging up mortgages and selling them to fixed income investors that believed that the AAA rating from the agencies actually meant something. We saw mortgage product innovation like ARMs work their way into the subprime category, creating refinancing risk after only a few years. We saw traders on Wall Street making millions. It just felt too easy, and it was all predicated on one belief, that home prices would never go down. Once Wall Street gets used to making money on a sector or a product, they will inevitably lever it up and squeeze everything out of it until there is no juice left. This was no different. It wasn't a question of if, it was always a question of when. While it took a few years for the thesis to play out, aided by the incompetence of the regulators who were supposed to be watching, when things began to unravel, it was violent, and the rest is history. So lastly, was I happy with how it was portrayed in the movie? Well, the book was pretty much 100% accurate, but the director of the movie, Adam McKay, did take some liberties with the content and did an incredible job of making a complex topic relatable to the public. Was I chased by an alligator while visiting abandoned homes? No. Was it an accidental phone call that helped introduce us to the infamous CDO trade? Yes. Was I always obsessed with where we would be having dinner? No, but I do enjoy a good meal. But the one thing that irked me was that Adam McKay labeled me as the optimist of the bunch. You may ask, why wouldn't you want to be labeled as an optimist? Just to clarify, I always try and be optimistic, and I was confident at the time that we were on the right side of the trade, but I was extremely pessimistic about what the world might look like if things unfolded as we imagined. For better or worse, having had a front row seat to the Great Financial Crisis gave me a form of financial PTSD that always makes me look for what can go wrong with an investment before looking at what can go right. While that will certainly cause me to miss some opportunities, it gives me a level of comfort I need, given that things I have seen in my time on Wall Street, and I hope I can impart some of these experiences that might help you as well. Coming up next, if you thought The Big Short was a great book and movie that chronicled the Great Financial Crisis, I have one even better. Bethany McLean, the best-selling author of many books, including The Smartest Guys in the Room, which chronicled the collapse of Enron, as well as All the Devils Are Here about the GFC, joins me.
Danny Moses Show is sponsored by Kalshi.
The golden age of America is upon us, and our future will be bigger, better, brighter, bolder, and more glorious than ever before. Thank you, God bless you, and God bless America.
Bethany, it's an honor to have you on the show. You're a prolific writer, and we have a lot to get to. Any comments on whether we're entering the golden age, as Trump just said?
Well, I think it depends on how you want to define golden. I mean, lots of golden places, I guess, but I think there are a lot of worrisome cracks.
Well, I agree. I think if you want to take the glasses half full, you can see some good stuff, and if not, you can see some bad stuff. So I just discussed how every crisis on Wall Street is different, but often rhymes. Let's start with the book you are best known for, that you co-authored following the collapse of Enron, called The Smartest Guys in the Room: The Amazing Rise and Scandalous Fall of Enron. You were writing articles and warning people well ahead of Enron's collapse. What first led you there?
So I had become a bit like you, skeptical of the conventional wisdom, because I wrote a column for Fortune called Companies to Watch, which was a stock picking column. And I started to learn during that period that Wall Street is always selling something, right? And there aren't very many people who are going to tell you that the thing they're selling might have some really fundamental flaws. That's just not the way it works. Everybody makes money when things go up. And so in that sense, the business world is a very, very strange thing. So I started trying to get to know short sellers, because I thought, well, it wasn't because I wanted to take down companies. I just was tired of being wrong and tired of not understanding the other side of the story, only to find out after I'd written a piece that I had just missed it. So I got to know Jim Chanos, and at one point he said, if you can tell me how Enron makes its money, please let us know. And I had worked in finance for a few years. At that point, I still knew how to do spreadsheets. And so I did my spreadsheets, and it was just interesting because nobody had the answer to what was a really fundamental question, which was, how does Enron make its money? And you'd think that wouldn't be possible. Isn't that what all the armies of analysts were supposed to be out there doing? But Enron always spat out an earnings number that was what people wanted to see. And so I think the lesson I learned from that is that if you can give the market a metric that is exactly what they want to see and that looks simple enough, people won't always look underneath that simple and appealing metric.
Agreed. And you're extremely busy these days. You're a contributing editor for Vanity Fair. I see new articles from you in the Washington Post. You co-host a podcast called Capital Isn't, about what is and isn't working as it relates to capitalism. I want to play this clip here and get your reaction.
It's like people are experiencing the economy really different because of the income inequality. And you can't just say, oh, GDP is going up, oh, the stock market's going up, everyone's doing great. Nah, like it's so different for different people. Yeah, I guess the billionaires are doing great, as always, but not the people who are making in the lower quintile or the lower half, honestly, the lower 80%.
Bethany, I know you write a lot of articles about what's going on in the economy, the K-shaped economy. This is a little glimpse of it, obviously. Share your thoughts there, if you don't mind.
So I think that person is exactly right. And I think it's really worrisome because this sense that the economy doesn't work for everybody risks eroding the fundamental legitimacy of capitalism. And I think some of the people who should have a broader sense of responsibility, not because out of morality, but out of their own self-interest, are failing to understand that the economy is, in the end, not just the economy, it's our social system, it's our democracy. And if you start to erode people's trust in institutions and in the economy, you eventually really do start to erode everything. And that's not to anybody's advantage over the long term. That said, I think AI has a potential for people not to have to care. In other words, like a conventional old corporation, JP Morgan doesn't do well at some point if the rest of us stop doing well. They actually do have to care. It's in Jamie Dimon's self-interest to care about the rest of the country. I'm not sure that's true about some of the new AI companies. And I worry about that fundamental link between having a functioning population and the ability of some people to make billions is getting broken.
We're going to get into AI in a minute, and I want to comment on that clip as well, which is I just don't see how the bottom half of the K is going to be able to catch up. And I think if the two were to meet in the middle or get close, I think the top half will come down. We're going to talk about in a minute. So I'm sure you're always working on a new book. Can you share with us how you're allocating your time these days and get into some of the current topics, which I know I just mentioned that you're focused on? I don't know if you can let the cat out of the bag or maybe what you're working on. So.
Just pure chaos, basically. I wish I had a plan for managing my time. I need to come up with that. I spend a lot of time on this podcast I do with Luigi Zingales at the University of Chicago called Capital Isn't, and we're exploring what's working in capitalism and what isn't because we view it as fundamental to our democracy. I'm writing for the Free Press and doing some pieces there, and I'm working for a startup media company called Hunter Brook and doing some investigative pieces there. I don't know that I'll ever write another book for a few years after I finish one. I say that was such a hideously painful process that I'm never doing it again. And then somehow I seem to get amnesia and go through the same thing all over again. But right now I'm still in the never, ever, ever phase.
Well, don't say that because you're a great writer and I'm sure something will come out of that. But so I consider you an investigative journalist, and I think it's needed more than ever given kind of the lack of enforcement from the SEC and the DOJ. You just mentioned you're also helping a company who writes short reports. Tell us how we can kind of protect ourselves if the regulators aren't going to do their job and what we should rely upon to kind of get information.
Well, I think there is an enormous amount of information out there today, and it is different from back in the day. Even at the time of the financial crisis, or definitely going back to Enron, if you were going to get exposed to people who thought differently, you had to know people and you had to dig your way in and figure out how to talk to people, and they were never on the record. Now, if you want to understand the skeptical side of things, it's everywhere. You can find it. And so the challenge then becomes sorting through the information and seeing it in the right context. And I still think that that's really hard because my view is often there's a piece of it's the prism through which you see things that matters, and there's a piece of information that will come along, and it's not that the piece itself is so critical, but it changes how you see everything else. And I think you just have to be very open to changing your mind and very intellectually flexible and not dogmatic. And unfortunately, that just flies in the face of human nature, which is that once we decide on a belief, God damn it, we're going to keep believing it and do everything we can to reinforce that belief. And I think you really have to fight against that.
All right, so let's touch on AI and its impact on stocks and the economy. You just wrote an essay on Free Press titled, "Will AI Doom Us All? The Market Can't Decide." It was in response to what is being called the scrutiny memo, which was a look ahead to how things could play out in 2028.
So we were just all struck by this memo, and people started blaming it immediately for the slide in the market on Monday. And so the idea was, well, what is this? And I think to me the key is that we're just in a time of fundamental uncertainty, not just geopolitical and economic as we're talking about, but then there's AI on top of that. And so the world is always uncertain, but it's particularly uncertain right now. And at the very same time, a lot of asset classes are priced to perfection. And so nobody really knows how AI is going to play out. And I think when you look at the swing from one case to another, it is so incredibly dramatic. You have this Citrini memo arguing that it's basically this doom loop where it's gonna destroy all our jobs and destroy the economy and be an incredibly negative thing for everybody other than the people running AI companies. And then you have people on the other hand who say it's fine, it's going to be great, it's going to usher in this new golden age. And the thing is, nobody knows. And on top of that, you have, even if it could cause immense economic carnage even along the way if, say, investments in data centers can't earn an economic return. So you have all these very scary scenarios mixed with some very beautiful scenarios, and nobody knows. And we're going to have to wait to see how it plays out. But I think that creates just this, on top of all the other uncertainty, it's just layer upon layer of uncertainty in our world right now. And it's really hard for human beings to cope with.
It's amazing how no one asks questions when the stocks are going up because the margin improvement related to AI, but when stocks start to go down, they're like, why are stocks down? And what does this now mean to my employment, in the future? And that's really what this memo is kind of a look at. So, all right, so we're beginning to see cracks in private credit, and I know you've been writing about this. And of course, the retail investor will be the one left holding the bag. Give me your thoughts on that, because I've shared mine endless times.
Yeah, so I have some skepticism about private credit. I understand the arguments, match funding, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, but it also intersects with a lot of these players pushing into the retail market. And so then the funding is no longer matched because, as we saw with Blue Owl last week, you've promised investors that they can redeem their money. And yet the money is tied up in investments so it's the same old problem. I also have this fundamental objection to this idea that, it's outside the banking system, so it's safe, because, as I think you agree and you said, everything always leaks back into the banking system at the end of the day. Subprime mortgages were supposed to be not a risk for the banking sector because they were supposed to sit outside the banking system. That wasn't the way it worked. And even now, there are all sorts of financial mechanisms by which the risk from private credit is coming back into the banking sector. And so I think what fundamentally bothers me the most about it is that I don't think it's private at the end of it all, because it now is such a big swath of the economy. It's the banking sector, it's people's retirement. The government will have to bail it out if something goes wrong. And that just seems, I think you can see that coming. And that feels fundamentally unfair to me.
Well, that'll be trillions of dollars if that does happen, and I couldn't agree more with you on that. All right, so you've written many books, including Shaky Ground, speaking of trillions, about the mortgage giants Fannie and Freddie. What are you expecting will unfold there? Because we're trying to get mortgage reform. Will that make mortgage rates go higher potentially if they can actually get these things public? Talk to me your thoughts there.
So I don't think that Fannie and Freddie will go public again, at least not anytime soon. I think that the Trump administration has realized that they're a wonderful toy, and because they're under government control, they can be deployed to do things like go out and buy $200 billion in MBS to push down rates. And once the government understands that that's a tool that they can use that can exert influence in markets outside of the Federal Reserve, I think it's very unlikely that they're going to want to give that up. And that was always the risk of so-called conservatorship, was that it would put too much of a swath of our economy, it would make it into a political tool. And I think that that's what has happened. But now that it's happened, I don't think the government is going to give that up. So I'm not sure Fannie and Freddie are ever going public again. I think a lot of the problems we see in housing markets today trace their roots to the great financial crisis. And it shows that even though it was however many years ago, 15, 16 now, it's not over. These things have very, very long tails. And I think it has had a long economic tail and a long tail, politically speaking, that has led to destabilization and distrust.
Yeah, all we did was transfer the debt to the government balance sheet from everywhere else. Any other policies? I know this administration wants to, focus on affordability and help consumers as much as they can. Anything you see they're doing out there? We just talked about mortgage, but there's housing, there's other things trying to keep costs down that you see that can really be effective?
I don't know that anything can be effective. And I think while they are making noises and talking about some really important things, they're also ignoring the elephant in the room. I have not yet seen any sort of coherent government thought process about AI. It seems to be a let it rip philosophy, because if we don't let it rip, we might risk losing to China. And oh dear God, what could be worse than that? And if this does go if the Scrutiny memo is right, and this does lead to the massive wipeout of jobs across the spectrum, then that is the biggest risk facing the country. And I would love to hear some coherent preparation for that, and believe that we might get some. It's like the China shock all over again, right? Where people saw that this could hollow out manufacturing communities, but everybody just looked the other way and didn't do anything about it. And that's been profoundly terrible for certain swaths of the country. And I worry that this is happening now at a much bigger scale, and no one is coming up with a coherent plan to address it. And if we don't get that right, I'm not sure that anything else matters.
Sounds like you have your next book, Bethany. It might be a couple years away, but it sounds like that will be one of them. So I can't thank you enough for coming on the show. Yeah.
I'm going to write a happy book next.
Happy. Okay, good. Let me know when you find that happy. It must not be in the financial markets. It must be in something else. So, well, thank you so much for coming on the show. Keep digging and writing about what people should be paying attention to. I look forward to having you back on, and, of course, reading your next book.
Thank you for having me.
When we return, my Kalshi pick of the week.
The Danny Moses Show is sponsored by Kalshi.
Welcome back to the Danny Moses Show. It's time for my Kalshi Pick of the Week. Remember, when you're trading on Kalshi, you're trading with other users. Similar to buying or selling a stock, you can jump in or out of your position at any time to lock in a profit or cut your losses. These are just my opinions, not telling you what to trade or offering any investment advice. In the first episode of the Danny Moses Show, I discussed the level of U.S. debt and why I believe it's a major issue. Maybe not right now, but at some point we're going to have to deal with it. And at the very least, it bears watching. The total amount of debt is currently hovering just under $39 trillion, and wouldn't you know, there's a Kalshi event contract for that. This contract allows you to trade where the U.S. debt will be at the end of Trump's term. Specifically, where will U.S. national debt be in the fourth quarter of 2028? What is startling about these prices is where I see $50 trillion trading, a little higher than a 50% probability that we hit that number by the end of 2028. Now, I am certainly in the camp that we will grow our debt faster than current estimates, but even under bearish scenarios where GDP is lower and rates are higher than forecasts, it's hard to see us piercing the $50 trillion level unless we have a major slowdown in the economy, some form of a financial crisis, or some event like a pandemic that would cause major government intervention. Over the last few weeks, there have been several forecasts released, some from nonpartisan organizations like the Congressional Budget Office, or CBO, that don't even exceed $45 trillion in debt by that time. I will note that on the same event contract, it is showing over an 80% chance that we blow through $45 trillion. So what's the takeaway? And what should you do? Pay attention, and while you're at it, choose the no to $50 trillion at 49 cents, because if you are wrong, there are way more important things to worry about. Again, these picks are not financial advice, but if you want to learn more, download the Kalshi app, read the rules, and use the promo code MOSES to get $10 when you trade $10. Back with my closing thoughts in a moment. Thanks again to Bethany McLean for joining me on today's show, and I hope you enjoyed hearing more about my Big Short journey. I'll be back with you next week for another episode of the Danny Moses Show. In the meantime, you can follow me on various social channels or go to DannyMoses.com, where you can find links to my latest posts and appearances, including the What Are We Doing Substack I co-author with my fellow Big Short partners, and watch these episodes anytime on ScripsNews.com/Danny Moses. So until then, I will keep an eye out on the markets for what everyone is talking about, what nobody is talking about, and what I think matters most to you. I'm Danny Moses.